Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Politico event after the U.S. election, Building Bridges or Walls. My name is Sarah Wheaton, and I'm a senior policy reporter here at Politico Europe. But before I moved to Brussels in 2017, I was a White House reporter for Politico in the U.S. And if you'll let me indulge in a memory for a second here, my last day reporting on the White House was the first full day of the Trump administration. We were called in for some sort of press briefing, and they put pictures up on the wall of President Trump's inauguration. And spokesman Sean Spicer came out and basically berated the press for lying about Trump's record-breaking inauguration attendance. And for me, that was a moment that I knew that politics as we knew it would be completely disrupted. And basically, it's been one surprise after another, one world-shattering surprise after another since then. And now Americans have gone to the polls to say whether they want another 4 years of these earth-shattering developments. And the result is decidedly mixed. It looks like former Vice President Joe Biden is ahead, but even here in Europe, we are zeroing in on Atlanta, Georgia, and Phoenix, Arizona to see what the final results will be. So today we're going to talk about what the long-term results could be, both of the actual election and the response to it here in Europe. So thank you for being here for this conversation. We would like to thank our partner, Microsoft, for making this virtual event possible. And you can participate by tweeting about it to @PoliticoEvents. And you can ask questions on Slido using the hashtag PoliticoUSElection. And we're also using that same hashtag PoliticoUSElection on Twitter. So if you're following us from the event website, Slido is embedded below the live stream window. And if you're following us from Facebook or Twitter, go to sly.do from your computer or phone and use the PoliticoUSElection hashtag to ask your questions. And as you know, at Politico events, we love to make sure to bring our audience in, and that certainly holds true for virtual events as well. And to show you how it works, please log into Slido now, and you should see this question presented by Microsoft that you're invited to write your answer to. The question is, what common areas of interest should be front and center on the transatlantic agenda in the coming months and years? So it's an open-ended question. You can feel free to just put whatever you want in there, and we'll check back in on the answers later in the event. And now I'd like to introduce Kasper Klinge, the Vice President for European and Government Affairs of Microsoft, for some introductory remarks. Kasper.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks to Politico for organizing this event. And listen, I think I should be a little bit honest here from the beginning in saying that it turned out to be more interesting than we anticipated when we planned this some months ago. And if I look a bit more tired than I normally am, it is because I think most of us are spending a lot of time watching television these days, following what is happening on the other side of the pond. You know, this is an important event, of course, for the United States, for the citizens of the US, but I think all of us also feel that this is a quite impactful moment, also in terms of relationships with Europe or indeed global affairs. So we are super delighted to have, I think, a fantastic panel for the discussion later today. I'm looking forward to getting some insights from everybody on the panel today. I think it is important for us, as we await the outcome of the elections in the US, to just remember and recall that we do have a shared history between Europe and the US. So regardless of what the result will end up being, no matter who will be sitting in the White House in a couple of months. I think it is important that we recall and really cherish the shared history, the focus on democracy, the focus on human rights, the focus on global trade. We'll be discussing a lot of these issues later, but perhaps also relevant just to mention a couple of things that has happened in the last few months. When you look at the State of the European Union speech by President Ursula von der Leyen, this was one of the main messages as well. Regardless of discussions, perhaps once in a while, a little bit of disagreement across the pond, we do have a very strong transatlantic partnership that we have to make sure that we ring fence also in times of turmoil. And actually just yesterday, the EU High Representative, Josep Borrell, put out a tweet along the same lines saying, as we await the outcome of the elections, let's not forget how close a partnership we have across the Atlantic. I do also think that when we look at the global pandemic that we are facing right now, and we were looking forward to hosting this event also at our center in Brussels, it's good to have it virtually. We look forward to being on the other side of COVID-19 as well. But to some extent, COVID-19 reinforces, in my view, the necessity of having a very close collaboration across the Atlantic to find solutions to make sure that we can recover in the best possible way from the ramifications of COVID-19. Also for private companies, both in Europe and certainly in the US, there is a lot at stake, and we will have to work together in finding these common solutions as we work ahead. Listen, I'm going to look forward to listening to many of the suggestions, not only by the panelists, but also by the people that are putting questions in the chat, and hopefully also trying to answer the question that we posed. If you wanted to ask me, and you didn't, Sarah, but I will take the opportunity since you gave me the floor here to begin with, what would be on top of my wish list for topics that we think we should focus on with the new US administration working together with the European Union? And this will come as a shocking surprise that I think a lot of the technical issues, technology and digitalization issues should be really be center of the agenda across the Atlantic. I would also mention artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and then last but not least, I think the sustainability agenda requires a lot of collaboration across the Atlantic. With these words, I just want to say thanks a million to Politico for hosting us today. We are delighted to be partnering up, and we look forward to the discussion. And if you do know what will happen in the US, do let us know during the debate today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Casper. Well, to give us a sense of what may happen and at least the state of the race for right now, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Cornelius Hirsch. I think his official title is intelligence analyst, but I would call him our data guru. So he will help us understand what's going on right now. Cornelius, please.
Hi, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm excited to be here today and joining this event and this exciting and timely event. My name is Cornelius Hirsch. I'm Politico's intelligence analyst. And as the motto of this election, and especially the counting process, is very much make America wait again, we are all still waiting for the remaining battleground states to be called for either of the candidates. But as it stands right now, it does indeed look like Biden is on track to secure the 270 votes in the Electoral College. And I would like to share some data insights and charts with you also in the next minutes here. So where do we stand right now? While Pennsylvania is not expected to finish counting the remaining ballots before Friday, there are good chances that Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia will have some preliminary results today. And after Wisconsin and Michigan were called for Joe Biden yesterday, the Democratic candidate needs to win any two of those three remaining states to make it across the 270 line of Electoral College votes. Because although Arizona was called for Biden by the Associated Press and the Fox News decision desk, their counting there is far from over and it's still very tight. At Politico Europe, I'm in charge of the polling aggregation on our Politico Poll of Polls site. And so I've been asked a lot before the election, can we trust the polls this time? And do you still believe in the polls actually? And now after the election, I have to ask as well whether we can actually believe that we've been discussing potential results with incomplete vote counts now for almost 36 hours. But let's have a closer look also at what the polls said and what the actual results were. Here I've charted for you the key battleground states with the leading margin for Biden in the final polls ahead of the election compared to the actual current preliminary results margin between Biden and Trump. And as we can see, once again, Donald Trump really beat the polls. He outperformed what polls indicated in basically all the key swing states, as indicated by that the lighter point on our chart, which is the polling margin, is above the actual margin, which is the darker, stronger color dot in this chart. And already after having the largest polling error already in 2016, the polls in Wisconsin especially were off by an above average polling margin, polling error once again. But in contrast to 2016, Biden's lead in the polls was so significantly stronger that it could withstand a 2016 sized polling error this time. And as more and more ballots are being casted and counted as well, sorry, as more and more ballots are being counted, we also see that the margin, that the lead of Trump in certain states is shrinking, and that several states, first Wisconsin, then Michigan, but also we see the same pattern in Pennsylvania and Georgia, that those states are trending towards blue in the end. So in the end, it does look like the polls did indicate the correct leader in the different races, and that they did indicate also the overall winner correctly. But definitely, we can say that the polls the pollsters do have some soul searching after this election once again to see why the polling error was such this size and above what we are also used to, what we are used to from pollsters and polls in Europe. But the question is also, what is the story of this election? And also in terms of what the different demographic voting patterns are telling us. And for this, I would like to show you some results from the exit polls. So this is from Edison Research exit polls. And although we have to be careful with those exit polls, because it was extremely hard this time around, not only for pollsters, but also for the institutes doing exit polls with this high share of mail-in ballots. There are still some interesting conclusions that we can draw from the exit poll data. And one story for this election is definitely the fact that Trump overperformed in Florida and Texas with Hispanic and Latino voters, which secured him also those states. So we can see when we compare the exit polls or the results from 2016 in those voting groups with the current exit poll data, then we can see that Trump did significantly better in those areas. And the other thing, which was also, and I have to point this out also in defense of the pollsters, although they did a bad job in predicting the concrete results, they did indicate correctly that Biden is doing significantly better with white women and also doing significantly better in suburbs. And that's also what we see in the exit poll data, that this is also what most likely is going to secure Biden's presidency win in the end. And just as an addition, also the interesting age group breakdown, where you can really see Biden doing much better in the younger age groups, and Trump still having a majority of supporters in the oldest age group among seniors, although Biden also did better in those groups. Yes, and with that, I'm actually already coming to the end of my short and hopefully insightful data presentation. But I also wanted to mention once again that if you do like those kind of data insights, then we have yet another event coming up next week on November 10th, the post-US election transatlantic trade relationship and transatlantic relationship will also be discussed in our next Political Pro-Intelligence Executive Workshop. And with that, I say thank you very much, and back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Cornelius. If I can put you on the spot with one question, if you could, what's your gut feeling of what went wrong with the polling this year?
As I said, at the moment, it does look like the polling error was smaller than in 2016, although it was quite sizable still. But of course, it was extremely challenging for pollsters this time around with the huge share of mail-in ballots, and also how this would affect turnout and how those voting intention that pollsters ask voters about, how this voting intention translates into actual counted and received ballots. But in the defense of pollsters, I think we have to say that in several states, and most states actually, the final polling error, once we have the final results, because at the moment we are still looking at incomplete results data, the polling error will be smaller than in 2016, and actually in several states within the normal margin of error. Definitely, the surprise was in Florida, where Trump really outperformed with Hispanics as it stands right now. And this is definitely going to be an interesting soul searching also for the pollsters. But I would say that polling error in the end will turn out to be smaller than in 2016. And that after all, we can also say that pollsters seem to have indicated the correct winner for almost all battleground state races.
Thank you, Cornelius. And also an important reminder that we're still looking at incomplete results. And that's not even so unusual either in many American elections, but just usually the trend is a little more definitive. So it doesn't matter if we're working with incomplete numbers. But on that note, I'd like to turn to our next session, which will be a chat with my colleague David Herzenhorn, who's the chief Brussels correspondent and the founding editor of Politico on both sides of the Atlantic, John Harris, who's joining us from Washington. Good to see both of you. I hope, especially John, that you've been able to get a bit of sleep. It's quite early on the East Coast. But John, let me start with you. Democrats, and I think it's fair to say many European officials, were hoping for a repudiation of Trumpism, and regardless of how things who ends up in the White House, it's pretty safe to say that repudiation did not happen. Where do you see Trump having an influence going forward, maybe even beyond the next 4 years? And is Trumpism about Donald J. Trump, or is it sort of the same kind of broader populist trend that we're seeing all over the world right now? We need you. I think you might still be muted a little bit.
Is that working okay?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. You have to answer all these questions, Sarah, with an air of contingency, because I think it's an error that we in the press have sometimes made by forecasting too far out or with too much confidence. And so I'm not prone to make sort of grand pronouncements or even to refer to President Trump in the past tense until we see what happens. In the remaining states. I fully agree with the analysis we've heard so far that the strong probability is that Joe Biden will prevail, if narrowly, in these critical states and in the Electoral College. What's interesting to me is this was, of course, a mobilization election more than a persuasion election. There weren't many people out there who were clicking on the website, trying to decide up to the last minute who's got the better education plan or who they'd rather have a beer with, or all the usual ways that in a conventional era, we would look at politics. This was a country that's an electorate that's deeply inflamed, and it became a question of mobilization. What's striking about President Trump is he, of course, mobilizes his supporters, mobilizes opponents in equal or greater measure. We have to remember that both Democrats and Republicans increased their vote totals from 2016. And unlike, as I had an article posted last night and on the site this morning that Democrats are looking at Trump voters and sort of saying, what is your problem? How could this be? Unlike 2016, there wasn't a single Trump voter who thought, well, I'll just vote for him to send a message, or I don't think he's going to win, but I want to back him as an expression of discontent with the status quo. This was a straight up, clear calling of the question. Do you support President Trump's norm-breaking style of presidency? Is that okay with you, or is it not? And the answer was clear that not a majority of Americans supported, but a very, very large minority do. And so anyway, as your question suggests, the spirit of discontent that Trump captured and exploited so effectively still very much alive. The election looks on track to end Trump's presidency. It does not look on track to end the movement of Trumpism.
Thanks, John. And David, on that note, I think it's fair to say that in many corners, part of rooting for Joe Biden is sort of hope for a return to normalcy in foreign relations. And is that really a safe bet, or are some elements of Trumpism going to be around no matter who's in the White House going forward?
Well, Sarah, there's no question that there has been so much bitterness, so much bluster, so much tension and chaos in transatlantic relations over the last 4 years that there's kind of this nostalgia that is a little bit overdone. The lenses are really just a bit too rosy. We know, of course, for example, that Donald Trump was not the first American president to really push on European allies to increase their military spending, to increase their contributions to NATO. And one of the top people who works in foreign affairs in the EU say that, in fact, the chaos, the gap, the vacuum, if there was one in U.S. leadership, was actually started by Obama, and Trump brought chaos into that vacuum, whether you talk about Syria or you talk about Ukraine, areas where there really are there were deficiencies in the Obama foreign policy. And so among Democrats, what you hear right now, what I'm hearing, is that there is really a debate underway, and some of them watching with quite bated breath to see what kind of foreign policy would President Joe Biden lead. Biden himself being one of these Cold War era foreign policy experts, longtime chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So those are the people who Ben Rhodes in the Obama administration, if you remember, famously labeled the blob. There's a lot of fear that not only did they not want these Cold War era types to come back, but even to correct for some of the upgrades and modernization in foreign policy that happened during Obama's 8 years. So there's this tension between the restorationists, the ones who just want to go back to Obama, to a third term of the Obama administration, and others who really see so many changes that have happened, not just in transatlantic relations, but in the world, that there needs to be a new doctrine created by Democrats going forward. And we'll see if and when Biden is confirmed as the president, how that plays out.
Thanks. And David, can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing of the reaction from here in Europe to the U.S. election?
Well, it's interesting how obsessed everyone is. As you heard, folks are bleary-eyed here as well, especially given the time difference, trying to keep up, keep an eye on results that are coming in on the West Coast. It's quite revealing, because there are many people who, of course, would like to convince us that given the strains in transatlantic relations during the Trump first term, that the U.S. is not that important anymore, that Europe is going its own way, and yet they are quite obsessed. Last night, I saw the former NATO Secretary General, former head of foreign policy, the High Representative for the EU, Javier Solana, tweeting excitedly in Spanish the minute that Michigan was called for Biden. So you get the sense that folks are watching these returns very, very closely. I don't think it's a secret that many of them are rooting for Joe Biden. But of course, there are folks who are not in Biden's camp. The Prime Minister of Slovenia, that's Melania Trump's birthplace, tweeting out congratulations to the Republican Party for its strong showing, saying it's clear that Trump has won the election moments after Trump himself declared that without basis for it. So you have a range of reactions, but certainly there is a general unease about the uncertainty and the continuing polarization in U.S. politics. The fact that it is make America wait again, as Cornelius put it, that there isn't a clear result. Continuing bewilderment among some about how elections work in the United States, given that we see Biden already up by 3.6 million or more votes in the popular vote, and with still a chance that he will not win this election and become president of the United States. So that leaves a lot of folks shaking their heads, wondering how it is that could happen. A lot more proportional parliamentary system voting here in Europe. So a range of reactions. Generally, I'd say unease, apprehension, hope, all in the same mix that you're seeing in the U.S., I think.
Thanks. And John, U.S. Politico had a headline that said something along the lines of Biden's going to be screwed whether he wins or loses. And that was partly in reference to the outcome of the down ballot races for the House and Senate. Looks like we will continue to have some divided government, especially for people who are focused on the transatlantic relationship. What will be the consequences of that potential gridlock? Again, working on still very much an assumption that Vice President Biden will ultimately end up in the White House, which is not clear at this point.
Sure. The deep kind of ideological partisan divisions, and beneath those ideological divisions are deep cultural divisions in the way Americans see their country and the way they look at each other across the divide. Those, we always have to remember, those long predated Donald Trump presidency. They're a reflection of a long-term trend dating back to the 1970s, a gradual erosion of trust in institutions of government. If you look at Gallup each year polls people. Do you have trust in the Congress? Very, very low. Do you have trust in the White House and the Supreme Court? Low. Do you have trust in non-government institutions, big business? The media, very, very low. In fact, the only institution that routinely scores above 50% in the United States in terms of trust and respect is the uniformed military. That's been a decades-long trend. And I think we have to always remember that President Trump is both a reflection of that and also brilliantly exploited that reality of mistrust. It's what allowed the politics of contempt, personal contempt, and institutional contempt to flourish. That's what he represents. That era of politics is never going to end in the United States until there is a decisive victory and a comprehensive victory by one side or the other, by one party or the other in this debate. It sure looked possible that 2020 was going to represent that. That's what Democrats were hoping, was that they would beat President Trump decisively and that victory would stretch deep into the government, that they would win back the United States Senate, and that beneath that, in the state houses around the country, enough Democrats would be elected that they would dominate in key states, dominate the redistricting process, which of course takes place in the United States every 10 years. Just as an aside, the Republican big victory in 2010 basically created a lost decade for Democrats. President Obama was never able to advance his agenda through legislative means after that. And deep in the states, Republicans controlled redistricting, which gave a structural advantage to the party for the last 10 years. So Democrats were saying, this is our chance. We're going to have a winning decade and give Democrats a lost decade. Give Republicans a lost decade. That did not obviously happen. Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have kept the Senate, and there's no evidence yet of gains going beneath the presidency. There's no evidence of big Democratic gains. So what does that mean? It means that division is still there. We're going to have divided government, and this decades-long trend is likely to continue for at least another few years. I do think it's near the end of its life. The country is becoming younger, more diverse, more socially tolerant, and Republicans still have a big structural problem in that the base of their support is older, whiter, and more traditional. So the kind of a climactic end to this era of politics is near, but I would say it didn't happen on Tuesday night.
Thanks. And we're about out of time, but I want to just ask you one other question, John. We saw the highest turnout ever in this presidential election. Biden had more votes than any other Democrat. Trump had more votes than any other Republican. I mean, isn't that a good thing for a democracy? Or is that a sign that everybody's terrified and angry? Should we go back to when nobody shows up?
Well, I think it's a good thing in the sense that 2016 we had questions of whether democracy had been manipulated, so there's no question that the vote here is a robust expression of democracy, and that's a good thing. The reason it's so robust, however, is people are deeply concerned about the direction of their country, and they're deeply concerned about the direction of the world. And so I think if we were in quieter, more placid times, you wouldn't see that kind of a very intense turnout. And I think a lot of us have a degree of nostalgia for quieter and more placid times. And that's not our lot in life for now.
All right, thanks so much to you, John. And David, I'm going to hand the virtual gavel over to you to moderate our next session.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And just a quick reminder, of course, to everybody who's tuning in about Slido, you can participate in this event by tweeting about it at Politico Events is the handle to use, or ask questions via Slido. You can do that at sly.do or slido.com. Use hashtag Politico US election for both platforms. If you're following the event on the website, Slido is embedded below the live stream window. If you're following us from Facebook or Twitter, go to Slido from your computer or phone and use the hashtag Politico US election to ask your questions. So now we're going to turn to a panel of distinguished experts on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm happy to introduce them all. We're joined by David McAllister, a member of the European Parliament and chairman of the Committee of Foreign Affairs. He's also a former minister president of Lower Saxony in Germany. That's also the home turf of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And he's also a vice president for the European People's Party. That's the center-right political family that has long dominated EU politics. Welcome, David. It's a day of Davids. We're also joined by Ambassador David O'Sullivan, one of the EU's most accomplished civil servants and diplomats. Most recently, he served as the EU's ambassador in Washington. He also served as Secretary General of the European Commission, the top civil service job in the EU's executive branch, as well as Chief Operating Officer of the External Action Service. That's the Foreign Affairs agency. We're also joined by Ambassador Miriam Shapiro, who served as deputy in the acting U.S. trade representative, the top trade post in the U.S. federal government during the administration of President Barack Obama. She held other positions in the private sector and public service, including at the State Department and in the National Security Council, and is now managing director at the global communications firm Sard Verbinnen and vice chairman of its public affairs practice. And finally, we're joined by Michael Steele. Michael was senior advisor for policy and communications for Governor Jeb Bush's presidential campaign, press secretary for Republican Vice Presidential nominee Paul Ryan during the 2012 presidential race, as well as press secretary to House Speaker John Boehner, where he and I knew each other well on Capitol Hill. He's now a partner and political advisor at Hamilton Place Strategies, a public affairs consulting firm in Washington. It's great to have you all with us. I'm going to start by showing a bit of deference here to our elected guest, Chairman McAllister. Start with you. It's little secret that relations between the US and Germany have been tense. Many Germans are secretly or not so secretly rooting for Joe Biden. Give it to us straight, if you will. How happy will Germany be if Biden reaches the magic 270 votes in the Electoral College? And what would Biden's election in itself help repair relations, or what else is needed? I think we need you to come in.
All votes have been kept. Okay now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, of course, as mentioned several times, we still have to wait until the final vote has been counted and we exactly know who will be the big winner. But I think it's fair to say that across party lines in Germany, a Biden administration would be seen as an administration that would give a new impetus for transatlantic relations. We would see more common ground with Washington on a number of very important issues like climate change, multilateralism, possible trade, and some foreign policy issues. I think also that we would see more stabilization in the transatlantic partnership when it comes to the Middle East, notably Iran and the Balkans. But still, foreign policy is a dynamic system, and things have changed during the Trump administration. But many things already started to change before Donald Trump took office. And we all remember that it was President Obama who started the so-called pivot to Asia. So we believe that Mr. Biden is a multilateralist, that he wants to shape an alliance of democracies, that he wants to reform international organizations instead of weakening or even destroying them. We will see the Americans come back to the Paris Climate Accord and to the World Health Organization. I think the American administration will be more interested in reforming the World Trade Organization. So there's a lot of common ground. But a final remark, we shouldn't be over enthusiastic, neither in Germany or in the European Union. It won't be a back to the old normal. It's more about defining a new normal, and challenges will remain, especially when it comes to trade on the one hand, and as already mentioned, the American calls for us in Europe to do more on security and defense and to spend more on our own security and defense, they will continue.
Thanks so much. Maybe I can turn to Ambassador O'Sullivan. You worked in Donald Trump's Washington, had a direct role in trying to maintain the US-EU relationship. Some in Europe say things were never really as bad as it seemed, that there was a lot of hype and hysteria, but in the end, the US commitment to transatlantic allies never wavered under Trump. Is that true? And if not, how bad was it? And from your perspective, what might be the top 3 things the EU will be looking for first from a Biden administration as a sign that things are changing? I think we can hear you just yet.
My mistake.
There you go.
The change under Donald Trump was very dramatic. I had the honor, along with the other members of the diplomatic corps, to be present at his inaugural speech, which, you know, was the American Carnage speech, where he gave a very dystopian view, not only of America, but in particular about allies and partners and trading partners of the United States who were basically ripping off America and treating the country very badly. That was the disruptive announcement that came from Donald Trump. And to be fair to him, he consistently kept preaching that message. So things were difficult. I would say particularly difficult for the European Union, because for the first time, we had a president openly hostile to the very concept of European integration. So not just with some of the things that the EU did, but the EU, its very existence, people around him like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and others openly said, you know, the EU was a bad thing. So we had to deal with that. I must say, on a day-to-day level, the relations with the members of the Trump team were perfectly cordial, no problem of access. We could talk openly about problems. We didn't always solve them. President Juncker did memorably travel to D.C. in July of 2018 and struck a kind of understanding, which at least brought us a sort of armistice on the trade issue, which still holds. And so, yes, we tried to manage as best we could, but there was a large range of disagreements, whether that was the climate change, the Iran deal was a particular point of difficulty, and of course the tariffs and the trade issue. Now, turning to what happens next, I mean, firstly, we don't know the outcome of the election. We have to respectfully wait to see what the American people finally decide. If I may do a very small parenthesis, I actually am very impressed with the way the American democratic system is holding up at the moment. This is not an easy period, but it looks as if everything is proceeding in an orderly way, notwithstanding maybe a little slip of the tongue of the president yesterday. But apart from that, the system is holding up, and it looks as if we will be on target for an orderly outcome of the election. We will then see what happens next, but my guess is that there will also be an orderly transition of power in the relatively traditional way, and that's a victory for democracy, for whoever finally wins. If we assume Trump 2.0, to be frank, I wouldn't be terribly optimistic there would be much of a change. I think we would face the same kind of challenging relationship that we've had in the last 4 years. I think David McAllister has perfectly characterized how things could be under a Biden presidency. And I think the key issues will be security, defense, trade, digital, and China. Those, to me, will be the 4 issues where we will need to try and build a better understanding between us and some greater cooperation. I think that there will be opportunities to do that. On the other hand, Trumpian politics has changed America. America is changing, as John Harris pointed out. And we in Europe have to understand that this is a different America. and we have to relate to it differently. And I agree completely with David McAllister. It's not a question of going back to the old normal. We have to redefine what this transatlantic relationship looks like for the 21st century in a way which will be different to what existed previously.
Thanks so much. You mentioned that Jean-Claude Juncker went to Washington, met with Donald Trump to talk trade. After that, Trump called Juncker a brutal killer. He seemed to mean it as a compliment, and Juncker certainly took it that way. Miriam, you're our trade expert here. And of course, one of the most difficult aspects of the EU-US relationship in recent years has been the trade wars set off by Trump, tariffs on steel and aluminum to begin with, also complaining, as we've heard, that the EU had long taken advantage of the US. But as we know, TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, big trade deal that was being negotiated, was hitting bumps, stalling even before Trump moved into the White House. How do you assess, Miriam, the US-EU trade relations going forward? Is there any chance of resuscitating TTIP in either a Biden or a Trump administration? And what's your prognosis for where things head? Thanks.
Great to see everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. I'm happy to provide some thoughts. While I'm a Democrat and I've been supporting the Biden-Harris campaign, these are my own views on how I see the issues. As others have said, I just want to say at the outset that the votes are still being counted. A number of states are very close, which is why that's still going on. The vice president is very close to getting the 270 votes that he needs, the electoral votes, to win. The Senate is not yet decided either. Right now, it's a bit of a tie at 48 seats for Democrats and 48 seats for Republicans. While many expect the Republicans to maintain their majority, there may be 2 seats that have to go to a runoff and won't be decided until January. So there's much we know, but there's still quite a bit that we don't know. Let me just say at the outset, I think we should expect fundamentally different policies overall and approaches to many issues, both domestically and in terms of working with close allies and partners, especially in Europe. It's unquestionable in my view that we need and want a strong relationship with Europe, no matter who is president. And that goes for our economic relationship and across the board. I think the vice president will be a very strong proponent of working with Europe, especially because we can get much more done together than either can do alone. Now, that said, I think he's going to have his work cut out for him to, try to repair some of the relationships that have suffered over the last few years. Fortunately, he has as much, if not more, experience than any other person that would hold the office of president. And so that's a huge, huge advantage. When it comes to trade, I think he's going to do things differently. What's going to be critical is making sure that all Americans, not just those at the top, can benefit. And I think it's going to start with a focus on rebuilding the U.S. economy and strengthening the middle class to make sure that we're investing what we need to in infrastructure, in education, in innovation and research and development, that we're training people, as Europe does very well, for the jobs of the future, and that will make the U.S. economy even more competitive. So I think a strong U.S.-EU trade partnership is a critical piece of the overall relationship. And I tell you, David, and as Ambassador Sullivan knows, because he and I have worked on these issues together for years, most people are surprised to realize that the U.S. and Europe do not now have a trade agreement. Nonetheless, there are areas where a trade agreement might be beneficial. But again, I think the first focus is going to be on making the investments in the U.S. economy that have been neglected and that are badly, badly needed.
Thanks so much. Everybody forgets the cheese and wine rivalries between France and California. Michael, we don't have the final election results yet, but we do know congressional Republicans performed far better than polls had predicted. Republicans seem very likely to retain control of the Senate unless the Democrats are able to follow that very narrow path that Miriam described through potentially 2 runoffs it would take in the state of Georgia. But it does seem that they will hold the Senate, that they will have cut into the Democratic majority in the House. But if there's one area where we saw congressional Republicans diverge with Trump in recent years, it was over foreign policy. Obviously, much stronger commitment in Congress to NATO and other alliances. How do you envision congressional Republicans taking foreign policy in the coming years, even constructing a new foreign policy doctrine going forward?
I think there's actually opportunity for a lot of progress there. As you mentioned, one of the areas where Republicans were willing to stand up to the president, assuming President Trump doesn't continue to be president, was in the area of foreign policy, confronting Russia. They were supportive, obviously, of his Middle Eastern policy, but much more committed to the traditional American alliances in Europe. I think that that is a commitment shared by both former Vice President Biden and Senator Mitch McConnell. And I think that if you look at the folks that are most chastened after the election night, assuming that it ends the way we expect it to, it's the fervent progressives who anticipated a blue wave that didn't materialize, and the fervent supporters of the president who believe that he would somehow eke out another come from behind victory, replicate his success in 2016, which it doesn't seem as though he's going to be able to do. I also think that on areas that are not deep societal divisions in the U.S., and the U.S.-European relationship is not an area of deep societal division, you'll be able to see Senator McConnell, President Biden, and Speaker Pelosi work on some medium-sized issues. And I don't mean to minimize it when I say that TTIP is kind of a medium-sized issue for the U.S. economy. With a great deal of success. I think that we're going to have a fruitful period of mature adult leadership on issues that don't pose deep societal divisions in the United States.
It's really interesting because there are a lot of people who say, as with trade relations, the era of the big omnibus trade deal may be dead. And on Capitol Hill, we've heard for a long time that if you want to find consensus, avoid that omnibus approach, giant, big legislation, and go smaller where you can find consensus. But I appreciate that you mentioned where there is polarization in the United States and in U.S. society, because that's clearly one takeaway from this. And before we go to some questions on Slido from our viewers, maybe I can ask you all to run through with a quick take how these divisions, primarily a result, of course, not a result of what Americans think about foreign policy, as Michael said, but what do these narrow election results, the bitter partisanship we've seen over the Supreme Court and other issues, what does that mean for how the rest of the world thinks about America, or how the U.S. deals with the rest of the world? David McAllister, maybe we can start with you.
The whole world has witnessed these US elections, and many throughout the whole globe also followed the election campaign very carefully. And I'll give you one example. I got up in the middle of the night here in Germany to watch the first TV debate between the President and Vice President Biden. And afterwards, I was actually sad. I was sad to see the 2 presidential candidates in the United States, in a country which is adored by so many and which has huge respect, the way they were treating each other. And these deep divisions in American society, but also the deep divisions in US politics, the way both sides attack each other. I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn here in Europe, and I certainly have made clear just this morning in a radio interview in Deutschlandfunk that we shouldn't follow the American line here, and that we have to make sure that in Europe, and especially here in my home country in Germany, we continue to treat political opponents with respect, and that we have a tough debate on arguments, but that we try to avoid personal attacks, and that in the end, politics is always about finding a compromise, it's about finding consensus, and it's also about the ability of building coalitions for the benefit of the people and the country. So I just do hope that the next American president will also be able to build some bridges, and that on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, Democrats and Republicans will cooperate better than they have, not only in the Trump years, but also in the Obama years, and both sides have to move.
Gabriel Sullivan, your quick take, thinking about the title of our event, Building Bridges or Building Walls. Is it possible to rebuild the transatlantic bridge, given that even if Trump is out of office, tens of millions of his supporters who still really believe in him and his style of combative leadership?
I think it is possible to rebuild the relationship. I think Michael is absolutely right. I mean, I don't actually think that the transatlantic relationship or the trade relationship or even NATO, frankly, is a huge issue for most American voters, to be very frank. I think they are much more focused on domestic, what we would call here in Europe, bread and butter issues, their jobs, the future of their communities, their ability to educate their children. Will their children have a better future than they, or because a very large number are actually disillusioned and believe their children will have a less prosperous future than they themselves experienced. So I think those are the real issues that drive politics in the United States. I think people outside see these deep structural changes. Americans have to sort this out. We can't help. This is something that Americans have to find their way forward, taking into account all these changes that are happening in American society, demographic, the inequalities, the regional inequalities, the cultural differences, the identity questions. But I do believe that it should be possible with the new administration, particularly one which is well disposed to allies, to alliances, to a degree of multilateralism. I think it should be possible to build a new and more vibrant partnership between the United States and the EU, but one in which, frankly, there will be a lot of responsibility on us Europeans to do more for ourselves, but also to do more in partnership with the United States and to be a stronger partner for the United States.
Thanks. Miriam, does it mean this polarization, does it mean the U.S. will be more inward looking, that even a President Biden would have to focus on healing wounds at home first?
Well, I think the polarization is clear in the number of close votes that we've had in several states. But at the same time, polling, not on candidates, but polling on issues shows that the majority of Americans, whatever party, are concerned about the economy, concerned about the pandemic, and increasingly among younger voters, they're very concerned about climate change. So those are issues that I think Joe Biden understands very well and will be very ready to address on day one. You just take the pandemic. Right now, the U.S. is suffering from over 230,000 deaths, and the toll is still climbing. Europe has suffered as well as other countries around the world. We've seen 8 million Americans slip into poverty just since May. We've seen 400,000 businesses go under. So I think the first job of any president is going to be to right the U.S. economy, and that will make us a stronger partner. But at the same time, as I said earlier, Joe Biden has been focused for his entire career on strengthening alliances, because it's important we're strong at home, but we also have strong partnerships. And that will enable the U.S. to advance its interests abroad, as well as to, again, build a stronger economy where we can invest more in our infrastructure and our education and our training.
And Michael, I'll kick it over to you with one added question, which is, do Americans care that much what the rest of the world thinks? I think we need you off mute. Are you still on mute? There you go.
No is the honest answer.
Okay.
As several of us have said, that the bread and butter issues, the economy, recovering from the pandemic, those are going to be the top of mind issues for any American administration for the time being. And I think that there is something to be said for the idea that military and economic alliances based on the situation in the world in the late 1940s are going to need to be reviewed, are going to need to be updated to reflect the realities of the 21st century. I just don't think that President Trump or the Trump administration has done that in a thoughtful, rational, comprehensive way. And I think that that's going to be a challenge going forward. I also think with regard to the vitriol that President Trump is a unique individual. I think that he saw even as he is, he saw the negative reaction to his performance in the first debate and was more responsible in the second debate. I also think that his attacks on Senator John McCain, tasteless and repeated, are one of the reasons that seems to be in the process of losing the state of Arizona. There are demographic and other changes that also explain that, but I don't think that his burn it down style is going to be widely adopted going forward. At least that's my hope.
And that takes us a terrific setup for one of our questions on Slido from a viewer, Richard, who hasn't left a last name, but Michael, maybe you can pick this one up first. Are there any moderate Republicans who Biden could reach out to and include in his administration as a start of the healing process?
Sure. I mean, I would look at that two ways. One, there are certainly moderate Republicans who endorsed the former vice president for president, former Ohio Governor John Kasich, former DHS Secretary Tom Ridge, who would be terrific additions to a potential Biden administration. I think returning to the tradition of having at least one cabinet secretary from the opposite political party would be a welcome change. I also think that the story of the United States Senate elections in some ways is that Republicans did better than expected, but in other ways you can look at it as the center held. Susan Collins is returning from the state of Maine, Tom Tillis from North Carolina. These are people that the former vice president, if he becomes president, will be able to work with. There'll be other Republicans who are either retiring or facing re-election in states that are uncertain politically for them. I'm thinking of Senator Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, Senator Rob Portman in Ohio, Senator Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, Senator Richard Burr in North Carolina. I think that there is a real potential. The handful of times that the Obama administration allowed Vice President Biden to work with Republicans in the Senate, the fiscal cliff deal in 2012 comes to mind immediately, the Recovery Act in 2009 to a certain extent. He was able to find common ground. He was able to find bipartisan solutions. Those solutions fell short of the left's expectations, and so he wasn't allowed to do it very often. But when he was allowed to do it, he was able to find that common ground and get things done.
And let's not lose the opportunity. You mentioned Arizona, one of the battleground states, votes still being counted. Tell us, how remarkable was it? I mean, we know the bitterness there over the late Senator John McCain and how Trump had gone after him, but also Representative Flake. How remarkable was that to see him come out, as he said, for the first time in his life to endorse and say he was going to vote for a Democrat? And what does that say about the importance of good relations with Capitol Hill, no matter what party you're in?
It's absolutely critical. And I think that the current president, President Trump, has never chosen to reach beyond his base of support, that 40 to 45% of the American people who are strongly supportive of him. And on Capitol Hill, I think that there are a lot of Republicans who are concerned about being on the wrong side of him, but relatively few, I think, who have been impressed by his skill in negotiating, making deals, as he always says that that's his great skill. It's not really been in evidence as president. You know, if you look at the big legislative priority that he did achieve, the tax reform bill, he had almost no direct involvement in those negotiations whatsoever, and in fact was pretty counterproductive towards the end of them. So I think that a lot of people are looking forward to the possibility of a president who is experienced in the legislative process and wants to find common ground on some of these real pressing issues, like responding to the pandemic, like returning our economy to prosperity, perhaps improving our infrastructure, perhaps improving our immigration system, et cetera.
I'll ask our other panelists, and I should say former Senator Flake, he was still representative when I left Washington, went on to the Senate, but to our other panelists who've all had experiences working with counterparts in Washington, other Republicans that come to mind who might join a Biden administration if, in fact, Biden turns out to win the presidency? Miriam, anybody jump to mind?
Senator Romney's name is often mentioned, but I don't know how he would feel about that. And obviously, I don't know what Vice President Biden is planning in that respect.
Let's turn to another question from Slido. One of our viewers, Damien Vickers, asks, how quickly and to what extent would President Biden reverse the record of Trump? Could he? And seek accord with the EU on climate change, in particular, rejoining, for example, the Paris Agreement. Could he do that very quickly, Miriam?
Yes. I mean, the vice president has many times called climate change an existential threat and made it clear that we need to address it domestically and internationally. He's made no secret of his desire on day one to re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. And so I believe he will go ahead and do that. And again, as I mentioned, there is polling that shows that a lot of Americans feel similarly that this is a critical issue. And whether it's trying to achieve a clean energy economy and get to net zero emissions by 2050, or rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, or working to take other steps domestically and internationally, people see this as a really, really important issue to get right.
And maybe for David and David, we have a question that's partly about the Iran nuclear deal. Of course, we saw President Trump withdraw from that. There's been a major effort by the European powers, the UK, Germany, and France, to keep that deal known as the JCPOA on life support, hoping there would be a change in the White House and a possibility for the US to come back into it, but also some sense that the US would never quite rejoin that deal as it was originally negotiated during the Obama administration. Thoughts on how that might change or what might happen to the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I think that the withdrawal from the JCPOA was a very serious error on the part of the Trump administration. I think if you look at the situation now, things are worse rather than better. I'm certain that the Biden administration will not just sign up, as you say, to what it was before. I'm sure there will have to be conversations, and in particular, addressing those issues not addressed by the nuclear deal, which was at one point anyway, the main issue for the United States. So the fact that we had not looked at the missiles issue, the support for terrorism in the region, the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic language, and so forth, all of this was up for discussion. And indeed, we were very, very close with the E3, the UK, France, and Germany, with Brian Hook in the State Department, and had really reached an understanding on how we would address those issues. But it was President Trump himself who basically said, I don't really care. I've said I'm going to leave the Iran deal. It's the worst deal ever, and I'm withdrawing. So I think we'll have to sort of pick up the pieces of those previous discussions and find the best way forward. But I think that we can salvage the essence of the nuclear deal, which was to prevent Iran from ever acquiring or developing nuclear weapons and doing so in perpetuity, and also addressing some of the other issues which we know remained unresolved even after we had concluded the nuclear deal. So yes, I would be cautiously optimistic that there could be much more common ground between the Europeans and Biden administration on this issue.
David McAllister, thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I couldn't agree more with the analysis of David O'Sullivan. I mean, one thing is clear, the Trump administration undoubtedly presented a number of challenges to transatlantic diplomacy. There were so many decisions which were difficult for us in Europe to understand, but I would say of all decisions Trump took, the three most difficult ones for us, real major blows for transatlantic cooperation, were the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change, then the American withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty, and the American withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And we do hope that on all three issues, we will see more American engagement now, that under a Biden administration, the Americans rejoin these agreements, and that we can see active European engagement. And one thing is clear on the JPCOA, and that's why especially so many were disappointed in Europe. This wasn't just an American deal. This deal belonged to all of us. And as David O'Sullivan pointed out, it was Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the European Union really actively involved over years. And then you had this unilateral approach from the American side, and this really caused disappointment in Brussels. So I'm also cautiously optimistic that we can readjust our joint policies when it comes to the Middle East.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks, David, for answering a question that we had on Slido before I even asked it from Bo Mandrup Jensen, who wanted to know, would President Biden reintegrate the multilateral fora and re-enter the multilateral fora that the U.S. had left under Trump? And we do get an initial yes from you on that. Maybe I can turn to one of the other international battles that was picked by this White House, and it concerns the coronavirus pandemic that's going on, the criticism and attacks on the World Health Organization that caused quite a bit of dismay. And for any of our panelists, feel free to jump in. There's been a lot of lament about a lack of U.S. leadership during this global health crisis. This disputes rather than attacks on China, rather than an effort to rally the world in a unified response. Do you think or expect Biden as president would do anything differently? And does the world even want that type of U.S. leadership? Michael, maybe you could chime in. Should it be the role of the U.S. to be the world's public health authority any more than being the world's policeman?
I think there's definitely a greater role for international cooperation than the Trump administration has been interested in. I think that there are legitimate questions about the World Health Organization's accountability when it comes to China and the origin of this pandemic that are going to have to be addressed in order for the U.S. to re-engage in a meaningful way, and in the way that I think a lot of people want us to.
And for our other panelists, is the world looking for U.S. leadership in this pandemic?
Look, I mentioned earlier some of the incredible costs that the U.S. has already experienced because of the pandemic, and we still don't have a handle on it. We just this week reached a milestone of 100,000 new cases in one day. So it's getting worse and not better. I think the most important point is this is not a disease that respects borders. And no matter where it came from or what happened in the early months, we have to coordinate better as a country and as a global leader to work with our partners and our allies, and frankly, all countries that are affected, to get a handle on this and to figure out as quickly as possible how we can combat this disease, develop vaccines, develop therapeutics, and together deal with it.
Either of the Davids, thoughts on pandemic cooperation?
I would just, to pick up on one word you used, you said American leadership. I mean, I'm nothing against American leadership, but I think it's more getting the U.S. back at the table with the rest of the international community, as Miriam has said. I don't think anyone wants America to do more than other people, but to be engaged, to finding international responses to this pandemic, which doesn't know any frontiers. And I think the EU and the United States are probably the two blocs best placed to provide some degree of leadership and some direction to this. The Commission and the European Union, with Ursula von der Leyen, has already taken initiatives about convening conferences on the issue. The US was not very active in that. So I think getting the US back to the table in finding international cooperation, particularly for the most vulnerable countries, those countries with very poorly developed healthcare systems, developing countries, where if they have to face this kind of pandemic, it could be a catastrophe, far worse than anything we've seen in our own country. So I think there is a lot that needs to be done. And as I say, I don't think we want the Americans to shoulder a disproportionate part of the burden, but to get come back to the table and join hands with the international community in finding solutions to this terrible problem.
Thanks so much. Ambassador O'Sullivan, if I can stick with you for a minute, we have a couple of questions on Slido. I'll take one from Laurent Bonneau about Brexit and the special relationship between the US and the UK. What scenarios for a special or not so special relationship US-UK post-Brexit exists depending on who wins the presidency? As your name gives away, Ambassador, you're from Ireland. Obviously, Ireland has a special stake in what happens in Brexit. We've seen House Speaker Nancy Pelosi warn very pointedly that there will not be a trade deal with the UK that gets through her House unless the withdrawal agreement that the EU has reached with the UK is respected. Your thoughts on the prospects of the relationship between the US and the UK, and for the US role as the EU sorts out its relationship, post-Brexit relationship with the UK?
Well, I think my compatriots would like to feel that Ireland has a special relationship with the United States, but that would be for them to answer. Look, I think that, and David McAllister is probably even better qualified than I to answer this, because he's heading up the European Parliament's role, and very important role, in Brexit. Look, I think Joe Biden, if it is he, wears his Irish attachment on his sleeve. He's deeply proud of his Irish roots. So yes, he will pay close attention to that issue. But look, I also think he's going to understand the importance of the United Kingdom as a partner for the US, as indeed we in the EU recognize the importance of a partnership with the UK, even though they have left. And so I think he will approach all this in a very constructive way. But yes, he will pay particular attention to anything that might damage the Good Friday Agreement or the peace process in Ireland, to which he, along with many Democrats and many Republicans, are deeply attached, because they invested heavily in it. America played an important role in helping to forge that agreement, and they want to continue to protect it.
David McAllister?
For the European Union, the deal on our future relation and partnership with the UK should be done before the next American president settles into office. And I'm pretty sure that there won't be finalized negotiations between the United States and the UK when it comes to their trade deal. So this won't have a direct impact on the ongoing negotiations between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which have now entered a very, very crucial phase. But what I would like to add to what David O'Sullivan rightly said is, unlike President Trump, Joe Biden strongly opposed Brexit. And as somebody who is proud of his Irish heritage, Mr. Biden has expressed concern about the potential impact of Britain's departure from the European Union could have on Ireland's economy and Northern Ireland's security. And I think Mr. Biden rightly warned that Britain must honour Northern Ireland's 1998 peace agreement, the so-called Belfast Agreement, and a US trade deal will only be possible with the United Kingdom if the Brits honour their commitments from the withdrawal agreement with the European Union and the very sensitive protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. And I think this warning had more impact on British politics than perhaps for one or the other warning coming from partners in the European Union.
Thanks. We have a question on Slido from Andre Enges. How will a future Biden administration engage with Russia and China? How about Biden's position vis-a-vis NATO? I want to focus on the China component of that. Miriam, maybe you could pick that up, because one area of great lament that I've heard in the EU over the last 4 years is on China policy, a missed opportunity for the US and the EU to really link arms, work on fixing some problems at the World Trade Organization, but especially in pressuring Beijing to comply with, to meet its commitments, to play by the rules. Your thoughts, Miriam, on would something change vis-a-vis China policy and cooperation on China?
I think we can get a lot more done in terms of both creating the rules that we need to see to have a more level playing field if we work with Europe, and then working together to enforce those rules. And China is a great example where the U.S. has gone it alone, and we don't have a lot to show for it right now. The trade war has hurt farmers, it's hurt workers, it's hurt consumers. I mean, just recently, the New York Federal Reserve and Columbia University did a study showing the damage to U.S. companies was nearly $2 trillion in terms of the fall in the value of these companies. And, you know, the trade deal with China, those terms just aren't being met. The purchases are maybe just over half of what they were supposed to be. So I think it would have been better, and it will be better, to work with our allies, especially those in Europe, to work together to show China the real costs of stealing intellectual property, of forcing tech transfers, of subsidizing state champions. Because keep in mind, together, you know, the U.S. might be 25% of global GDP. Working with Europe, we're about 50%. We will have a lot more leverage and a lot more impact if we can coordinate our policies and advance them together.
We're nearly out of time here. I'm going to take one more from Slido, which is, by the time of the next election, can America produce, sorry, lost it there. Will Donald Trump want to continue to lead the Republican Party or be sidelined? And Michael, maybe you could tell us 2 terms is the limit, but they don't have to be consecutive terms. Might Donald Trump, if he loses, come back in 4 years? He'll only be a year older than Joe Biden is right now, and try and make it a revenge match.
Yes.
You might.
Okay. I can give you a longer answer, but yes, there is a very real possibility, particularly given how close the election result has been. There is no doubt that the president will continue to play a key, if not dominant, role in the Republican Party, and it is very, very possible that he at least holds out the possibility of running for the nomination again in 4 years.
Well, thanks to everybody. I'm going to kick it back to my colleague, Sarah, to wrap us up. Thanks to all our panelists and to all the questions that we had from viewers on Slido.
Thanks, David, and thanks so much to our panelists. Just to kind of reflect on some of the themes here, the thing that really stood out to me is that everybody is gearing up for a new normal rather than a return to some sort of old normal. I mean, the bottom line is that a lot of our conception of normal was based on the period right after World War II, and it's just not working out for anybody anymore, whether it's the structure of our alliances or economic arrangements. So there's kind of universal recognition that needs to be updated. And also, on the other hand, the U.S. is not the role model as far as a democracy that is really succeeding at civility right now. And so for many European countries that maybe after World War II saw the U.S. as kind of a thing to follow, they're charting their own course a bit. But some of the changes in the U.S., it is a new America. Some of those changes are driven by a diversifying populace, a populace that is changing in its social values. And that's an area where, if I could editorialize a little bit, I think that may be in Europe's future as well. So the continent would be wise not to dismiss that as just an American challenge. The other thing that stood out is, regardless of who is in the White House, they may well take an America first approach. The economy has been hammered by the coronavirus pandemic. There will obviously be a lot of domestic concerns, a lot of domestic healing that will need to take place. And so while the focus here is on the transatlantic relationship, that may not be a priority for the next White House, whichever one it is. But at the same time, that could actually be an advantage because issues like trade are less hot button issues. So those could be some early quiet wins for both sides of the ocean. The last thing that emerged was obviously the challenge of rebuilding a relationship that has been fraying, and that fraying obviously started before Trump in a more quiet way. But we heard a lot of raw feelings about the U.S. departure from the Iran deal, from the Paris Climate Agreement. And it'll be a challenge to move forward on those. At the same time, there's also good reason for the U.S. to invest in better relations with Europe. As we just heard, the U.S. has been trying to take on China alone and has not really achieved very much. So it sounds like the motivation to forge the way in a new normal will be there, but it will be quite a challenge. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. I want to thank not just our speakers, but also everybody who is watching online. And the most popular question I saw on Slido was a statement that our sign language interpreters rock. So I want to endorse that question. Thanks very much to our interpreters. Thanks very much to our partner, Microsoft, for making this event possible, and to our audience members. And please feel free to send us feedback at events@politico.eu. We always want to improve. And on that note, actually, let's take a look at the outcome of our audience question that we had at the beginning of the session. So as we can see, climate change, top theme for our audience of what they want to see at the center of the transatlantic agenda. So on that note, let me say that Politico will continue hosting more virtual newsmaker interviews and panel discussions in the coming weeks. And so I would make sure that you check out politico.eu/events/future events. It's only getting colder. The lockdown's going to continue. And so we'll make sure to keep you informed and maybe even a little bit entertained in the coming months. Thanks so much for joining us.